Welcome into this week's edition of the Research Corner. I'm Tony Mulvey, joined by Joe Antoshak. Joe, it's been a minute. How are you doing?
Hey, Tony, I'm doing well. How are you?
You know, I can't complain. We're going to talk about something today, and I kind of want you to lay out the groundwork because you did a lot of the background work on this, and it's our Freight Sentiment Index. They've been out for, almost a month now, but we haven't had a chance to talk about it. So Joe, kind of lay out what the Freight Sentiment Indexes are and what we're looking at here in this chart.
Yeah, so the Freight Sentiment Indexes, these are basically a collection of indexes that we survey for every quarter, where we're asking, different segments of the freight transportation industry to tell us on a sliding scale how they're feeling about certain things, right? So we're looking at profitability, we're looking at kind of workforce trends, and then overall business investment sentiment. We put these together, combining near-term and long-term angles to these sentiments, and then generate overall segment scores. You see here shippers, brokers, 3PLs, carriers as like the three segments. And then we have like an overall average score for essentially the freight transportation industry at large. So that's kind of a rundown of what it is. And this is the first quarter, Q4 2023, that we have had data going back now to the prior year. So we could start to compare year over year, right? We just started this at the end of last year. And the way to think about this, generally speaking, is that, of course, the data we have in Sonar, that's kind of like our play-by-play commentary of the freight market. These sentiment indexes, and this is true for economics at large, are sort of like the color commentary. Like this is how you help to explain in a way that is not just someone saying their opinion. It's still data driven, but it is more mood, right? It's not quite like rejection rate is this right now. So that's the general overview of these freight sentiment indexes.
Yeah, I like the kind of adage there, like how you can compare it to the economic, because you get the consumer sentiment index and it's like in the tank, but consumers are still spending money. Like Black Friday was stronger than expected. So it's like, this is what people are saying or how they feel, but it's not actually how they're acting. We look at this chart, I mean, you can see the sharp downward move really across carriers and brokers in the fourth quarter. I think some of that has to do with where the market is, right? You were expecting to see things start to pick up, and from a volume perspective, they have, but there's so much capacity in the market, it hasn't been able to drive any of this strength that maybe these two were expecting to see. Whereas the shippers, you see that upward movement, they're kind of like, oh, we're in a better position than we have some footing. And I don't think that's really a surprise when you look at, again, where the market is currently. I mean, thoughts?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, the one thing to note about shippers is that while they're up quarter over quarter, they are in fact feeling more negative or less positive than they were in Q4 2022. So there has been some like degradation of sentiment for them over the year, as is true for every segment. Everyone is feeling worse Q4 2023 than Q4 2022, or on the whole, segments are feeling worse, right? Not everyone. Of course, it's not perfectly evenly distributed. But so, yeah, so, I think that the other thing to note here is that like you look at the general trends of the line and you see kind of the differences in how these segments swing. Carriers tend to be the most volatile, or at least that's been the experience over the last 5 readings that we've taken. Brokers are sort of in the middle of that in terms of how they change quarter to quarter. And then shippers are like pretty stable overall. They tend to be the most positive, and they tend to change the least quarter over quarter. And I think that'll continue into 2024. What I'm curious to know about is whether, right, when the market turns and pricing power is more firmly in carrier favor, are we actually going to see shippers consistently less positive than carriers? I'm not sure, especially if, say, like the wider economy holds up and consumers are still continue to buy things throughout next year.
Yeah, I think that volatility that we see on the carrier side is going to stick around. I don't think I think just given the nature of their cycles in comparison, you have to think about it from a shipper perspective. Like the supply chain and freight transportation is very small but very important part of their business, right? It's not how they make money versus the carriers whose sole income is based on the movement of those goods. So definitely something to pay attention to. Joe, thank you so much for joining me on this week's edition of the Research Corner. We'll be sure to check in with you again next week. Right now, we'll take a quick break, but we'll be back with more Freight Waves Now after that.